I want you to imagine walking into a kitchen, picking out a banana, peeling it, and taking a bite. So here's my question. Which end of the banana did you peel? The majority of people peel bananas at the stem, and it just makes sense. It looks like a handle you can grab, bend, and break open. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't always work well. Sometimes the peel won't break open, so you've got to twist the stem. Or worse, you have to dig your fingernails into the skin to get things started. Years ago, my banana peeling ways were forever changed when I came across a YouTube video that showed how monkeys peel bananas. Did you know that monkeys peel bananas at the tip, not the stem? I couldn't believe it. So I grabbed a banana, pinched the tip like they did in the video, and voila, the peel fell open. This got me wondering why most of us have peeled bananas the wrong way for so long. And the reason is simple. Most of the things we do, we learned by copying what we saw others do. And when it comes to supporting nonprofits and causes, many business leaders do the same. They copy the philanthropic work they've seen others do. So it's time to learn how to peel the banana of philanthropy from the more effective end. Welcome to Generosity at Work, a podcast that explores the ways in which generosity is at work in our workplaces and how it's at work in the world. I'm Keith Jennings, a community impact executive with Jackson Healthcare, and in the last episode, we began a journey toward answering the question, how should a business with a desire to make a difference in the world get started? And we learned that the first step is seeing the business as the neighbor it is and getting out into the community to listen, learn, and understand needs. In this episode, we're going to learn how we as business leaders can leverage this community time to become the kinds of partners that nonprofit leaders are desperate to find. The roots of corporate philanthropy can be traced back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That was the Industrial Revolution. Wealthy industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were among the first to formalize philanthropy. They advocated for using their wealth for the public good. The U.S. Revenue Act of 1917 established tax deductions for charitable donations, encouraging more individuals and businesses to engage in philanthropy. And this propelled a shift in corporate giving between the 1920s and 30s as companies began to establish foundations. The mid-20th century, following World War II, marked a significant expansion of corporate philanthropy as businesses started to see it as part of their responsibility to society. This included increased corporate involvement in social causes, which were driven by things like the civil rights movement and a growing awareness of corporate social responsibility, which is more often referred to as the initialism CSR. By the 1970s and 80s, CSR became more formalized, with companies adopting structured giving programs and aligning their philanthropic activities with their business goals. And from the 1990s to today, traditional philanthropic practices morphed into strategic philanthropy, where businesses align their social impact initiatives with their core values and business objectives. But this brief history of philanthropy doesn't really tell the story of many small to mid-sized private companies whose focus is local and whose generosity doesn't make headlines. How can we approach and practice philanthropy and community partnership in ways that can have a societal impact and in ways that make sense for our organization's unique culture and business cycles? Jennifer McCrea is a renowned leader and innovator in the field of philanthropy. She's worked with thousands of leaders and social change organizations around the world and is widely recognized for her approach to making generosity more personal, impactful, and relationship-driven. I had the privilege of participating in Jennifer's exponential fundraising cohort. So I reached out and I asked her to share where philanthropy has come from, where it is today, and where it appears to be going.
I think it's very much about we have enough resources. How do we get those into the flow? And I think it's not just about financial resources. It's, of course, about financial resources because we do have to get money moving for all the important work in the world, but it's also about people's time and their passions and their expertise and their life experiences and their networks. And how do we get all this stuff engaged and moving? And so philanthropy starts from this idea, of course, of I have enough and I'm interested and I'm curious how I could have impact and move into that domain. And philanthropy, like everything else, has been, kind of turned into, I call it the philanthropic industrial complex or the nonprofit industrial complex. And, it's gotten into a bunch of bad habits. So what I think is interesting right now is I think there's some recognition of some of the bad habits. And I think there's some recognition of the open possibility and, some of it's course correction right now. So I'm happy to go into that. But that's in general what I think is interesting. So philanthropy, in general, I think started, if you're kind of looking at it as a business, and I think if you look at some of the early philanthropy with the Rockefellers and, Carnegie's and all that, it really was about trying to fill a void. I mean, there was lots of different emotional, psychosocial, emotional dimensions I won't get to, but from a practical boots on the ground approach, I think it was very much about putting into action to create libraries, all this stuff. And then I think it didn't have enough sort of accountability and metrics baked in. And so I think places like the Gates Foundation, others really were responding to philanthropy is wonderful, but how do we actually evaluate what change is happening? And so there was a lot of movement, I think, particularly in the 90s, to start having a more accountability-based approach. What happened, and this is my opinion, right? I don't have hard data around this, but just from where I sit and interfacing with so many philanthropists and organizations, I think it did overcorrect for the human dimensions of the work. And I think data started driving the process. And what's happening, I think, that you're seeing is kind of a movement back to how do we bring the humanity back into this?
I asked Jennifer to explain what she meant by the phrase philanthropic industrial complex. She described it as an overfocus on outcomes rather than the process. In other words, philanthropy makes outcomes a product to be manufactured rather than allowing outcomes to be an inevitable result of creative, collaborative learning and problem solving.
I think you had a lot of scientists on your first season talking about this idea of neuroplasticity and we become what we do. And we're in a lot of bad habits, everywhere. We're in a lot of bad habits where philanthropy is no different. And anytime you put money at the center of any relationship, you start to have, a customer kind of sales relationship, which is fine if you're understanding what that money is enabling. My problem in the domain of, well, it's like could be potentially in a lot of domains, but in this one we're talking about is when money gets at the center of the relationship, there is inherent in that a power dynamic where the donors or the giver have the power. And so my, philosophy, my belief and my experience, having worked with so many organizations, that actually stifles creativity. And that actually stifles the ability to respond and to be in real relationship where you're learning, you're changing, you're adapting, you're taking risk, you're trying, because of the inability to have really authentic, honest conversations. And a lot of transparency gets lost everywhere, all the way around, from the asker to the givers. So my belief is, how do you take money out of the center? It doesn't mean money's not in the mix. It is in the mix, of course. It's how do you put at the center of the equation at all times the change you're trying to see? So if you're making it about the change, then you can have different relationship about, we all have resources we're putting into this. The full-time employee has a huge amount of resources, of time, expertise they're putting into it. And then how do you match that with the kind of other resources that are needed? And then it's a very different kind of conversation that's much more abundant and much more realistic.
The big idea here is that philanthropy is about leveraging what you have in an effort to change things for the better. It's not about controlling outcomes or social climbing. And the way we change things for the better is through relationships. This connects back to the idea in episode 1 of Business as Neighbor. A true neighbor puts the relationship first, and good things flow out of that. So I started wondering about the best place for business leaders to lean into as they begin their philanthropic journey through relationship building. And what Jennifer shared will surprise you. And we'll learn more about this after the break.
Generosity at Work is made possible by Jackson Healthcare. As one of the nation's premier healthcare workforce companies, we're driven by our mission of improving the delivery of patient care and the lives of everyone we touch. Founded by our chairman and CEO, Rick Jackson, we began on a simple principle that talented professionals with a shared purpose can improve lives. Serving more than 10 million patients each year, we're proud to appear on the 100 Best Companies to Work For list by Fortune and the Companies That Care list by People. And we're always looking for bright professionals with a drive to serve others and grow professionally. If that's you, visit us at jacksonhealthcare.com.
During my time in Jennifer's cohort, she brought in Marshall Gans, a Harvard Kennedy School professor and longtime grassroots organizer, and he trained us in the public narrative framework he developed. Gans's public narrative model has 3 parts: the story of me, the story of us, and the story of now. At first, I thought I'd be writing a kind of elevator pitch I could use and adapt in my work building the case for specific causes. But what I learned changed everything for me. I still vividly remember Mr. Gans asking a participant why she founded the nonprofit she represented. And she said something to the effect of, to help people. Okay, said Gans, why do you want to help people? Well, she responded, and he why'd her response. And on this whying went until she shared this deeply personal story about something that had happened to her as a young person. It turned out the real why that led to her founding this nonprofit was to help kids like herself. Mic drop. This happened to all of us. We all discovered that our motives to drive social change were fueled by very personal experiences we had as children and as youth. So the big idea here is this: philanthropy doesn't start with giving money. It starts with understanding who you are and why you're here and how you can improve life for others. But it doesn't stop there. Philanthropy is about connecting our who and why with the who's and whys of others. It's about finding shared purpose.
I really use this framework that our dear colleague and friend from Harvard, Marshall Gans, uses, which is really about enabling leadership, and leadership not as a position you hold. Because the challenge is, of course, in our businesses, we do have formal roles and we have formal positions, and that's helpful. And we need to understand, the flow chart and all that kind of stuff. But in this domain, we like to invite leadership as a practice. Again, this goes back to neuroplasticity, the same idea of how are we becoming what we're trying to enable in the world. I see like a board member, I sit on the board of many nonprofits and I work with lots of boards. I see that as a practice, a domain of practice, much more than a board as a position. So I think if we can start to think of ourselves as leadership, think of ourselves as leaders that are understanding how to be more and more skillful, more responsible, more responsive, that gets really interesting. And so I use Marshall's definition of leadership, which I'll share really quickly because it's incredibly helpful. I think if there's one thing I would offer up to your audience to think about, it's leadership as a practice. And I use Marshall's definition, which is accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose in the domain of uncertainty. And that to me is a perfect encapsulation of how we need to identify ourselves as powerful social change agents. Because first of all, there's accepting responsibility. That means there's choice involved. You can choose to stand on the sidelines. You're totally a free agent. You don't have to say, we're going to make the choice to actually do something in our communities, to get more involved. There's a stretch involved. You're actually accepting responsibility to be part of, this solution. The second piece of that, accepting responsibility for enabling others, means that I'm not just enabling myself. I have to start right with myself, but then how am I inviting other people, whether it's my colleagues, my other business colleagues, how am I inviting others in the community? How am I actually enabling others to achieve shared purpose? That's obviously our strategy, whatever we're looking to do. And then the most important piece of that is in the domain of uncertainty. Because you don't need leadership when the world was, of course, we don't know a second from now. We all know we're in a crisis of leadership globally. It's because the world's like increasing, and of course, in the world of AI, it's just going to get more and more and more quick and uncertain. And so we're going to need people who are identifying as true leaders more and more and more. And philanthropy is a great place to make that happen because you have less kind of responsibility a lot of times than in other domains of your life. I mean, there's many reasons why philanthropy is an interesting domain, but that's one of them.
Leadership is accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve a shared purpose in the domain of uncertainty. What an incredibly deep and activating definition. Our journey as business leaders seeking to be a partner for change in our communities starts with accepting that responsibility and leaning into building long-term relationships on trust and shared purpose in the midst of uncertainty. What I learned from Jennifer is how important the social emotional piece is, which, as she pointed out, is another way of saying accepting responsibility for enabling others.
I think we have to start with ourselves. Like we have to start with understanding our own motivations, why we care about this, why is this important? And if it's all tied just to like the rational mind, I think that's going to give you some false choices that isn't that helpful. So yeah, to our point, it's useful to have the data, it's useful to understand okay, I care about this from a business perspective. But I think there's a deeper inquiry that we have to be asking ourselves as leaders using the framework we just said, which is I'm sitting here making a choice. I have agency. Why does this matter to me? What about me as a human as I exercise and flex my capacity to be a really strong member of a business? Why does this matter to me personally? Because if you don't have that grounding, it's going to get deprioritized every time. Something else will come along and it won't be as important. So I think if you can really, this is why, we use that framework that you're familiar with, the story of self, us, and now. And then we can look through the story of self, we can keep finding sources of motivation intrinsically in our own lives for I might not identify as someone who's been in the foster care system, but I am definitely a human business leader who can identify with a time that someone or something entered my life and fundamentally changed the trajectory of it. Could have been like a sports program, could have been, a coach, it could have been a teacher, but somewhere along the line, which is the same thing that, with the saying, the challenge we're facing in the foster care system is this is an intervention of entering someone's life at a critical moment and changing the trajectory of it. Well, we've all had that. And that's the story of self. That's the grounding. Then you turn it into, okay, why should I as a business leader care if my community gets involved, and how expansive is my community? Is it just my business, or is it, what I mean? There's all kinds of questions about how do we create a sense of a collective identity that's really, committed not just to the cause we're working on, but to each other. Because the truth is, if you do this well, the members of your team, others are going to get a deeper sense of commitment to each other because they're in a deeper, more, potentially a deeper kind of different dimensionality of relationship.
When I reflected on how personal this work is and can be, Jennifer broadened my thinking away from thinking of this as it's personal to me to this is personal work because it's about all of us.
I look at an us, if I look at your community, your organization, your company, whatever language you want to use, I see it as its own living nervous system. I think we have so much expertise now around our minds, our own minds, our brains, our nervous systems as people. But honestly, our organizations are their own nervous systems. They change if one element of the nervous system, it's our network. And so it's important that we understand, okay, how are we seeing this not just as a bunch of individuals working on this, but as a collective? And then, of course, the third leg of that stool is how do you turn that into action? But I think we jump to action without doing this kind of the other work that's so critical. And it is tied to values and it's tied to a lot of those questions, but it's really tied to a deep, Yeah, it's tied to this deep understanding that we exist in a network.
This episode has been about redefining philanthropy and leadership. You may have assumed we were going to focus on giving strategies, but what I hope you've learned is that you can't start with giving strategies until you have a deeper understanding of yourself, the needs and goals of others, and a relationship network with a shared purpose to serve all involved. Once you have these in place, you can begin peeling the banana of philanthropy from the tip. And you can avoid the pitfalls of copying what others do as they try to peel their bananas from the stem. Philanthropy starts with you and me. It starts with our personal stories and motivations for why we want to contribute to social change, whether that's providing people with safe housing or providing access to healthcare services or whatever change we want to see in the world. But it doesn't stop there, because philanthropy isn't solely about giving money to get results. It's about actively participating in community and relationships with others in a collective effort to learn and work together toward better outcomes for all. This is the work of a leadership. This type of leadership requires vulnerability, patience, and continuous learning. And it requires the resource many business leaders have the least to give: time. Time, it turns out, isn't limited to business leaders. It's a resource businesses can offer their communities through their employees. And we'll explore this in the next episode. Generosity at Work is produced by Jackson Healthcare's Love Lifts Community Impact Platform as a free resource for professionals seeking to go beyond profit and be a force for good in their communities. My sincere thanks to Jennifer McCrea for her leadership and impact on the lives of so many change agents. Learn more about Jennifer and her course in exponential fundraising at jennifermccrea.com. And you can learn more about Jackson Healthcare and its community impact work at jacksonhealthcare.com.